So over to you, Patrick. The clicker is here.
Thank you. I haven't got a presentation because I don't really know how to make presentations. And when I've tried to make presentations in the past, there's always stuff goes wrong with them. For me, there's more important things about giving a presentation. I've done 4 Curlew talks in the last week. The last one I did, I just had new cattle pens delivered, and I was really keen to get them set up. I wasn't watching the clock. I had to get to Penrith by 6 o'clock. A full day moving about big cattle hurdles and trying to get everything sorted in the Manitou, and it was a complete pain. Arrived at the talk in Penrith to realise that I had ripped the entire arse out of my trousers and had nothing else to wear as the evening was. So there was, standing with my back to the wall, I thought, actually, do you know what? PowerPoint presentations to one side. We'll worry about them tomorrow. Let's just get dressed. That's almost the first and most important thing. I am Patrick, Laurie. I recognise loads of what we've talked about so far today, and one of the reasons why I don't have a presentation is because these talks, these events, can go all sorts of different ways, and it's always a pity to anchor yourself into the thing you want to say when actually it can fit, you can follow your nose and try and respond to some of the other speakers. So I'm putting myself on a high wire, partly out of ignorance, but partly because we're starting to pick up bits and pieces of trends and patterns here. So as was explained earlier, I'm a hill farmer. My family have always been farming in Galloway, about 10, 15 miles west of Dumfries, on a few hill farms there. Galloway cattle are our big thing. Blackface sheep were always our big thing. But my basic of my farm is 1,600 acre hill farm, very rough grazing and traditionally very good, amazing for curlews. I wanted to be a gamekeeper, that kind of gamekeeping that I really wanted to do, which was very closely involved with black grouse and curlews. My dad's generation, it was possible to be that kind of gamekeeper. And it just wasn't for me, because the birds were starting to go downhill in such a dramatic way. They just didn't have that sporting interest to them. And so I did work as a gamekeeper, but I really wanted to be in Galloway. Galloway Place is the really, really important part of all my conservation. Is Galloway's my home. That's where I'm from. It may not sound like it, but that's where I'm from. So I had to kind of make myself work in the place where I'd chosen to be. Choose where you're going to be and make it pay for itself was my conundrum. So I went into farming. I picked up bits and pieces. This is relevant, by the way. This is not just everybody look at me, because it's great. I love it. It's fantastic. But this is going somewhere. I went in to work for an organisation called the Heather Trust, which promotes what at the time was being called integrated moorland management. So it was working with a lot of grouse moors all the way across the UK, trying to get them to think more broadly beyond just grouse productivity, but what about waders, what about peatland, what about all sorts of other things. I did that for 7 or 8 years, then I went to work for Soil Association, then I went to work for RSPB for a while. I did lots of things basically to pay the bills, to pay the farm, to keep me in business. But it was always black grouse and curlews were my 2 main things. And what the point here is that's immediately relevant to what's been said earlier is I now work kind of for Scottish Government on a project that's called Working for Waders that Mary mentioned earlier. Working for Waders is interesting, and I recognise what we've talked about earlier in Working for Waders. So in 2017, the Scottish Government commissioned a report called Understanding Predation. It vanished. It's one of these civil servant reports that it just completely slips under everybody's radar. But it was a really great report because it basically seemed to say what the science is saying and what people on the ground are saying are being treated as 2 completely different things. So how do we take a sample of what the science is saying and match it against what the people on the ground are saying? Surely there's a better way that we can get these 2 often polarized sides of the argument, get them to work together. So gamekeepers and farmers were given a lot of survey information about ravens. Particularly, there was a big issue at the time about ravens and ravens predating lapwing nests and curlew nests. Gamekeepers were given a lot of guidance on doing surveys, and they produced surveys, and they almost completely matched with the surveys that were being done by the ecologists. And that at the time was quite an eye-opener, because gamekeepers were used to being told that they didn't know the difference between a chicken and a raven. So the fact that they'd actually produced really good, usable data was really valuable. And that all fed into this idea that we really need everybody working together, whether it's gamekeepers, farmers, foresters, conservationists, ecologists. Everybody needs to be on the same boat, because we do come from a bit of a background of conservationists will fix it and they'll tell us what to do. And it's much more productive, as Michael's just been saying. It's not, that's not the way forward. And actually some of the best projects now, Understanding Predation became working for waders, trying to get farmers interested in wader conservation is a really important part of the picture, but also lots of farmers are already interested in wader conservation. So it's trying to work out how to support them and make sure that they're getting what they need, because every farmer, every group's different. So that's a bit of a preamble to say this is the kind of work I'm now doing, but I think it does link hugely to what you're describing here and what's going on in parts of England, what's going on in parts of Wales. It's almost, from a farming perspective, it's a bit frustrating, because the momentum is now, oh my God, farmers are useful. Farmers can help. Farmers are actually not the bad guys, which has always been so incredibly obvious to me and the people I work with on all sorts of conservation projects. So it's linked. But in Galloway, one of the things that when Michael asked me to come and speak, I was thrilled, love coming here, love coming to Northern Ireland. I was trying to think what's going to be relevant. And there's 100 different ways to talk about curlews. What's going to be most relevant? And from Galloway perspective, from a southwest Scotland perspective, forestry has been a massive, massive game changer in terms of curlews in my part of the world. And I know that rings a bell in big parts of Ireland too. And I was last year at Loch Derg over at above Pettigo, and fantastic. I was taken up onto the hill by an old bugger he was going out to turn peat or do something with his peat, and we went out together and we got out on the hill, and I saw fantastic curlew habitats, and then I just saw these massive big panels of forestry all the way around us, and we were talking about the birds he still sees. I was impressed by how many red grouse he still had up. I mean, not big numbers of red grouse, but they were certainly there. So I think there's a lot of crossover between the southwest of Scotland and the forestry, and also further south. Michael, I'd be right in saying further south of here, forestry is, I mean, it's just bigger and bigger.
In Leitrim, the same.
In Leitrim, okay. So what happened in Galloway, as a quick potted history, after the Second World War, we were designated, Galloway Forest Park was designated in the middle of Galloway. The Scottish government, the UK government, bought on behalf of the people of the UK what is it? It's something like 35, 40 square miles of forest right in the hill ground, right in the roughest part in the middle of Galloway. And that was put almost exclusively into commercial spruce. It wasn't really up for discussion. It sort of happened to us. And at the time, nobody really knew what the impact would be. And at the time, when you read some of the rationale behind it, people talking about whether we should or shouldn't do this thing, civil servants again talking about whether we should and shouldn't do this sort of thing, I found bits and pieces that say we're fine to do this because there's nothing up there but curlews. So curlews actually mentioned by name. That was late 1940s, an enormous expansion of commercial forestry there, and a lot of the infrastructure too, a lot of the sawmills, a lot of the roads, a lot of stuff was put in association with the Galloway Forest Park. Then it was a lull in the 70s and 80s with all the tax breaks. We got a huge amount more forestry, almost trebled the amount of the original Galloway Forest Park, which is when I was born in 1985. I grew up in kind of the shadow of that real upsurge of planting, and we saw tremendous declines of particularly lapwings at first, then black grouse, and then curlews latterly. And since 2010, we are seeing almost the same again. And it's really frustrating from a curlew conservation perspective, because one of the reasons that forestry came in the 70s and 80s, it came in on this incredible burst of enthusiasm, everybody buying this land, big investment companies buying land to offset it against their tax bills. And then there was a bit of a, whoa, oh my God, this is not good. We're damaging peatlands, we're losing wildlife. We better not do any more of that. And so it's kind of frustrating that in the last 10 years, people have started to say, we'll just do that anyway. And we now sort of, and the adjustments say there's a conversations between, that's the bad old days of forestry. We're doing it differently now. We're doing it properly now. We're doing it more sustainably now. we can't always measure that. That's really hard. It's really hard to prove it. It certainly is better. But when we were talking this morning about how do you talk about Curlews and Forestry, well, probably in the room we've got a pretty clear idea that extensive areas of commercial forestry are just bad for curlews. And as much as you try and smooth that over, and as much as you try and mitigate that kind of land use change, your curlews are going to be on the back foot. They're going to struggle without complicated and, let's be honest, very expensive measures in order to keep them in place. So what we're now seeing in Scotland, we've had, what is it? I think it's, yes, it's 17,000 hectares of new softwood creation in Galloway since 2016, which is twice the rest of all of Scotland put together. So in that sense, in terms of the finance and the subsidy, we're being zoned almost as the forestry bit because we link to the north of England and all the big timber processing plants are in the north of England. Chipboard in Hexham, there's massive processing plants in Longtown and Lockerbie. To that measure, our curlews are doing exactly what you'd expect them to do in those circumstances. They're just falling through the floor. Each year they get worse and worse and worse and worse. I did have a map of where all my curlews used to be when I was a kid, and if you look at it now, it's, yeah, you don't like looking at that map too often because it's pretty grim stuff. But it's no surprise then that curlews are responding really badly. And I mean, traditionally, they were also in the low ground, they were in meadows, they were in, yeah, pretty good productive ground. Galloway's weird in as much as it's got a huge amount of rough ground, it's also got a huge amount of really good ground. And as a result, the really rough ground has gone to forestry and the really good ground is being cranked up for, we've got immense amount of commercial dairy farming in Galloway. The small area that is Galloway produces over half of Scotland's milk. So that's a big burden to put on what you're expecting an area like Galloway to produce. So our curlews were just in complete freefall. And I would say, this is always difficult to have a presentation that ends on a positive note, but I'm generally a bit of a Grim Reaper character anyway. I don't think we're going to have curlews much longer in Galloway. And that, to me, Mary and I did a presentation in Galloway in the spring about the future of curlews in Galloway. And the questions at the end were, well, that's a bit depressing. And I feel sorry for people who are just finding out about this for the first time, but at the same time, 5 minutes, brilliant. I feel sorry for people who are finding out about this for the first time. But there's... It's really hard to give hope in a situation where curlews have got absolutely everything against them and they're just slipping away through your fingers. But the hope, because Mary's nagged me on this and Ryan has as well, about how to be a bit more positive and how to find the positive side is, within that broad umbrella of, you've got forestry, so you're probably not going to have curlews, there are little wiggle rooms here and there. There are little things we can do, perhaps not in a broader sense across Galloway, but we can learn lots from where we've got it really wrong. I'm always just amazed, though. Mary showed that. That's a really interesting thing Mary showed there about how much curlew research is now being done as opposed to 20 years ago. Curlews are were really common, familiar bird, but actually there's masses that we don't know about them. And when we talk about curlews in forestry, we know that they're not a good match. Curlews and trees aren't a good pairing. But we find it really difficult to provide the data as to why, and the scientists understand-ish that that's how, but we know predators and associated predators are an issue. We know that loss of habitat's an issue. We understand some of the drivers. But there's still an awful lot more work to do on this, and we still really don't understand some of the finer detail. And that, to me, is a really good opportunity for to do some of the principles I was talking about at the start there, about how we gather the data. It's not about getting the ecologists and getting the scientists in to study these things. It's about trying to work with the stories that people, farmers and gamekeepers are actually seeing on the ground all the time and fitting those back into policy. Because it amazes me that if you, and honestly, I'm closing in, don't worry. Sorry?
Keep going.
There you go.
No slides, that's all right.
No, honestly, as I say, I'm just glad to be dressed. So as far as I'm concerned, this whole day's been a victory. When new forest plantings come in, and this would be a great conversation to pick up with people maybe later in the day when we can have conversations about it more broadly, but when new forest plantations come in, ecologists go out and they do a site assessment and they'll say, ooh, curlews on that hill. And then there's a few different ways that can go, partly sometimes down to cynicism, in as much as they'll say the trees are worth more than the curlews, so I'm afraid that's just what's going to win it. But sometimes there are other conversations about, right, well, we need to address that, we need to manage that, we need to think about how you get some occasionally pretty harebrained schemes about, well, we'll leave a little area that we won't plant with trees in the middle of a plantation, and the curlews can go and nest in that bit, which is probably in the room, we would say, pretty scatty stuff. And it's okay, we'll do wader scrapes elsewhere on the property, or we'll do wader scrapes elsewhere in the parish or in the county. We're still not quite nailing exactly what the impact is, partly because new planting scheme comes in, mitigation measures are offered, but there's no requirement on the landowner, in Scotland certainly, to do a follow-up. So we've got these plots that are left, say for example, we've got plots that are left in forest that are unplanted. Nobody goes back 5 years later and says, oh, there's no curlews there now, because there's no requirement to do it. So we perhaps would all agree, that's bloody obvious that you've just got rid of your curlews, but it's very difficult to inform future forest policy because you couldn't prove it didn't work last time. That's the kind of thing that we can do, all of us can do, farmers, gamekeepers, everybody can get involved in these kind of conversations, because it is not a done deal. We don't actually know a lot of these final things. And actually, it's really important to prove them, really important to gather data on how, I mean, that sticks in my throat saying that because I'm a farmer and not a scientist. But it's really important to gather data and really important to prove some of these points. And we only do that by everybody working together. And that, I think, fits with some of the stuff. Michael, thank God Michael's nodding. I just caught Michael's like, if you'd been standing there shaking your head, I'd be thinking, oh, what have I just said? Michael's nodding, so that would probably be a good point for me to stop. But I'm really interested to see how today's going to go. And honestly, this little 25-minute section could have been an entire day, because I'm really interested, as a tourist, I'm really interested to understand what your experiences have been of forestry and curlews and curlew conservation generally. But there's not only a matter of conservationists and land managers working closely together. There's a huge argument for us all getting to, it's 150 miles as the curlew flies from here to my house. It's nuts that I don't know what you're doing here, and it's probably nuts that you don't know what I'm doing. So making sure that we're all better connected, today's a really good chance to do that. Thank you. I hope you probably would have preferred me to have had some pictures to point at, but it's too late now, it's done. Thank you very much for having me. That's my bit.